While many store owners will do anything they can to catch and punish shoplifters, one man encountered a thief in the night that would call all of his deeply held beliefs into question and teach him that death is not always the end of love. Eldington, North Dakota is all but forgotten today, but in the 1920s it was a quiet town in the middle of vast swaths of farmland. On the outskirts of the town was Cook's General Store, a respectably sized establishment that served the entire county. Although it was the only store within 50 miles, Martin Cook, the owner, kept prices as low as he could to eke out a meager living and ensure that the hard-working families of the town could afford what they needed. One night, in 1929, Mr. Cook was closing shop when he heard the bells chime at the front door. He looked up and saw what he described as a haggard-looking woman, her skin white as a sheet and her black hair mussed and tangled, hanging in clumps over her face. Her eyes were inset and dim as though they had no sparkle to them. As she walked, she curiously made no noise, even though it was impossible to walk across the wood flooring without it creaking under every step. The woman didn't look at him. She didn't seem to look at anything. She stared off into nothingness as she made her way to the back of the store where she retrieved a single bottle of milk, and then, without word or even an attempt to pay, walked slowly out of the store and into the night. Taken aback, it took Mr. Cook a few minutes to realize what had happened. He walked briskly to the door and stood there watching the mysterious woman slowly walk down the dirt road out of town. Cook was reputed to be a good man and reasoned to himself that the woman was probably transient and hungry. He actually chided himself for not trying to do more to help her, but in the long run it was just one bottle of milk. It wouldn't ruin him, and obviously the strange woman needed it more than he did. He locked up the store and went to bed upstairs. The following night, after the last customer of the day was gone and the sun was long set, Cook was climbing the stairs to turn in for the night when he heard the chimes at the front door again. Strange, as he distinctly remembered locking it. He grabbed his shotgun and gingerly made his way downstairs, only to see the same pale-skinned woman glide across the store floor, another bottle of milk in her hands. She crossed the threshold exiting the store, and Cook decided it was time to give her a piece of his mind. Once was charity, but twice was theft. When he made it to the door to catch her, it was indeed locked, blocking his way. Without the keys in his hands, he could only watch as the mysterious woman disappeared into the darkness again. The third night, Cook was ready. The sheriff and two other men, a couple of curious townfolk who had overheard Cook's story, waited for the woman to make her appearance, and, a few minutes after the last rays of the sunset disappeared under the vast horizon, the storefront bells jingled, and the woman entered. She walked past the four men as if they weren't there, and, as she had done the previous 2 nights, fetched a bottle of milk from the refrigerator and walked out the front door without a word and without payment. The men had decided ahead of time that they would see where she would go, and so, with a thin crescent moon above, they followed the woman down the dirt road out of town. If she knew the men were following her, she didn't seem to care. The speed of her walk never changed, and she never looked at the men, who followed only a few feet behind her in silence. A mile down the road, it was becoming more and more obvious where they were heading. The cemetery gates resolved out of the fog ahead of them, and the black-haired, white-skinned woman glided soundlessly through them. She made her way to a freshly dug grave, and then, in plain view of the men, sank into the ground. Upon seeing this, the sheriff gasped and dropped his lantern. The grave belonged to a woman, Belinda DeWitt. She was reputed to have been a prostitute from Dickinson who had become pregnant by a wealthy and married banker who had paid her handsomely to flee. At least, that was the rumor. The sad reality was that she had died in childbirth and the infant had also not survived. The two had been buried together in the same coffin 4 days earlier. The next morning, the sheriff ordered that the grave be exhumed. The men, including Mr. Cook, took shovels and set about the macabre task of unearthing the grave of Belinda DeWitt and her child. It was easy work as the earth was still loose, and within the hour their shovels struck the wooden box. When the coffin was opened, Belinda's decaying corpse greeted them. Her black hair, tangled and matted, and her skin as white as a sheet, just as she had appeared in the general store over the last 3 nights. In her arms, however, there was movement. An infant, weak and cold, but alive. Mr. Cook retrieved the baby and wrapped it up. They must have made a mistake. Perhaps the baby was too weak to move when it was born, and they only assumed it was dead. The men at the grave were speechless. The quiet was palpable, so much so that the subtle noise that emanated from the grave could be heard by all, and sent chills down the spine of everyone who heard it, everyone who knew exactly what it was. It was the tiny clinking of 3 empty milk bottles in the casket that had been used to keep the buried infant alive. Belinda DeWitt, her baby now safe, was never seen again.